welcome everyone. I'll say good evening to those of us in the same time zone as me. For some people, I know it's a good early morning, and we have people all over the world, I think. So the OPC is delighted to present this program tonight about the crisis in US-China media coverage. And we have 3 correspondents who can tell us about their personal experiences and their analysis of what's going on. I will introduce the moderator, Jodi Schneider, who will then take it from there. Jodi is a senior editor at Bloomberg News in New York, and she recently returned from 5 years in Hong Kong, where she was president of the Foreign Correspondents Club. If during the program, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. We will get to it. If you feel comfortable, please in the chat, say your name and the name of your news organization. And we will probably have the questions throughout the program. So again, thank you to all the panelists, and hand it over to you, Jodi.
Thanks, Patricia. Thanks for that nice introduction. And thanks to all of you for joining us. As Patricia said, I'm Jodi Schneider. I'm a senior editor with Bloomberg in New York, and I will be tonight's moderator. Please put your questions in the chat, start thinking of them and submit them as you can. As Patricia noted, I was in Asia for more than 5 years before returning from Hong Kong at the start of this year. I was president of the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong for 2 terms before leaving. Yet, though things have deteriorated in Hong Kong significantly in terms of press freedom, I came back to the US voluntarily. I came back for career and family reasons. Our 3 panelists did not leave China voluntarily. They were pushed out of the mainland, either effectively expelled because their journalist visas weren't renewed, or because of direct pressure on them and their families. Tonight, we will be hearing their stories, and we will be talking about the implications for journalism and press freedom of the loss of such coverage directly from China. I'll briefly introduce our panelists and then get right into a conversation. Obviously, Zoom makes a conversation more difficult than if we were all at a bar somewhere, but because our panelists are around the globe, we wouldn't be able to do this in a bar. So I hope all of us will participate, and I hope you'll all join by asking questions. We'll start with Chris Buckley, who is joining us from Australia, who is a veteran and senior China correspondent for the New York Times, who covered the early stages of the pandemic from Wuhan, coverage that helped lead his publication to win a Pulitzer Prize for public service last week for its pandemic coverage, so congratulations. And then he was forced to leave China. We also have with us Yvonne Murray, a reporter for Irish public service broadcaster RTE, who left China this year with her husband, John Sudworth, who was pressured by Chinese authorities for his reporting for the BBC. She is now in Taiwan. We also have with us Gerry Shih of the Washington Post, who was among the wave of journalists expelled from China. His publication, the New York Times and Wall Street Journalists, were expelled in 2020. He comes to us from Washington, DC, where he is preparing for a new assignment in India. I'd like to start by asking each of the panelists to tell us their story about when and how they came to leave China. I'd like to start with Chris, who's in Australia. Chris, you were there in China during the pandemic when the world was changing. Tell us how you came to leave and what was going on in China at the time. I hope Chris can hear.
Sorry.
Yep, that's okay.
I'm muted now.
Yep,
so I was just saying, my experience is probably a little bit atypical in that I was in the middle of the pandemic reporting, and more complicated than that, I was in Wuhan at that point. I'd gone to Wuhan to report on the outbreak, and I hadn't expected to be stuck in the city for so long. And even at that point, while I was reporting in Wuhan, my visa situation had become complicated in that I'd been receiving a series of short-term visas. And the last one I received was for 1 month. So even at that point, my visa situation for China was looking shaky. And when I went to Wuhan, because I was still processing my most recent visa, I didn't even have my my passport with me. So to make a very long story short, the Chinese Foreign Ministry informed me while I was in Wuhan that I would not be extended a new visa, and I was expected to leave the country after I left Wuhan and did my quarantine in Beijing. So after leaving Wuhan in April 8, I think it was, April 10, I spent a couple of weeks in quarantine in Beijing, had about 11 days to pack up everything from essentially 24 years in China, and then moved back to Sydney. I did try to go back to Hong Kong as well, where I had a valid work visa. A similar story, to cut things short. I was there for 1.5 months, but then it was then told I would not be extended a new visa.
And were any reasons given? Was there any, or even back channel, were you able to find out, or was it just you are no longer welcome here as a journalist?
Well, we can easily surmise some of the reasons given the unhappiness with reporting, not just in the Times, but in other publications in recent years. But I wasn't given explicit reason, apart from my visa having expired and me being expected to leave the country.
And do you think that if you hadn't been in Wuhan, if all this hadn't happened, if you were just reporting from Beijing or someplace, that you might have stayed there, or do you think this was sort of inevitable at some point?
Oh, there's a million possibilities, and I don't like to think about them too much. I think if I had been in Beijing, my chances would have been higher, at least.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. I'd like now to go to Yvonne and ask her about her departure there. She obviously had legal threats and very direct personalized attacks on her and her family. So Yvonne, can you tell us about how bad things were getting for you there, and what happened in the months and weeks leading up to your family's departure?
Yeah, well, the personalized attacks were against my husband, John, who works at the BBC. But the decision that we took to leave in March of this year was really a long time coming. It wasn't spur of the moment. It wasn't due to any specific trigger. The pressure had been building over a number of, we'd been in China for 9 years. And the pressure had been building over that time. We were experiencing what all reporters do there, the surveillance on the road, the harassment, the kind of detention in local police stations, that kind of thing. But then the pressure really began to build with these short-term visas that Chris was describing. A few years ago, John was put on a 1-month visa as well, and had to keep renewing it every few weeks. That created a huge amount of uncertainty for our family. We have 3 children, so we were all living there in Beijing. The visas would never be renewed until the 11th hour, and this is quite a purposeful tactic, it seemed to us, just to make it difficult for us. But then, amid all this pressure, I think things really started to take quite a sinister turn then, with these threats of legal action, as you mentioned. Officials began to say things like, someone might sue you. And of course, when you hear that kind of thing, this is designed as a kind of veiled threat, it seems. These things are not said lightly. And then, of course, from there, it seemed to escalate. The threats of legal action would be repeated at the Foreign Ministry out of the mouths of officials. Then it was accompanied by this very coordinated, state-sponsored, personalized attack in state media against John personally and his reporting. And it began to feel really uncomfortable, being on the receiving end of that, trying to raise a family in Beijing. We were living, it's an authoritarian superpower. And when it decides that it's going to personalize attacks against you, it does become very uncomfortable. And so in the end, we just felt that while we could probably stick it out, we're doing our jobs, it kind of comes with the territory. We felt that it just wasn't fair to continue exposing the children to that. It didn't feel like a comfortable or a particularly safe place to be raising a family. So that's why we took the decision to leave.
And was it also affecting your work that I would assume it's difficult to try to do day-to-day reporting under that kind of pressure?
Yeah, it was, but I think as well, when you've been in China for quite a long time, you are a bit used to having to work under pressure. I don't think that's unusual particularly. I think maybe for us it became it was difficult to calibrate towards the end. You know, China's changed quite a lot. If you look at the kind of wider context over the past few years, something has shifted. There's a feeling that, you know, perhaps the state is beginning to act with increasing impunity against foreign citizens. You know, some obvious examples of that. The two Michaels were taken a few years ago. The situation with the Australian journalist last year, and of course, you know, for me, this year I had just come back from interviewing an Irish businessman, Richard O'Halloran, who's been detained in Shanghai for the past 2 years, unable to leave. There's an exit ban on his passport. And it was a real reminder of the kind of, you know, legal quagmire that you can end up being stuck in. And really, there's nothing, you know, your own government can do. And it certainly began to feel uncomfortable. And just one thing I should say, that when the morning that we left, and, you know, it still makes me kind of angry and upset to think about, there were secret police outside our house as we were, you know, trying to bundle the kids into taxis to get to the airport. And for me, that felt like, you know, it's one thing to harass us, but to do that to our kids as they were already quite distressed, having to leave their home and their families and everything that was dear to them. And they tailed us all the way to the airport, followed us all through the check-in. So that kind of confirmed to us that, okay, well, this is something, you know, quite personal, quite targeted, and that we were making the right decision to leave.
Thank you. Gerry, you left in 2020 when you and your colleagues at the Post and colleagues and other journalists at the Times and the Journal did not have your visas renewed. Can you tell us what that was like, sort of this happening, and it became obviously a big press freedom story worldwide, and whether you saw this coming?
Yeah, I probably had the most representative story since I was a part of that wave. Unlike Chris, who was in Wuhan, like Yvonne, who left under arguably, you know, far more insidious circumstances, I was a part of that wave of there were a dozen of us. The announcement came, I do remember in Beijing time, it was like, you know, maybe 10 or 11 p.m. You know, it wasn't a message delivered to us personally. It was actually an announcement, I think, on the Foreign Ministry's website that they would be revoking visas for the American journalists at these organizations. You know, it really sort of, in some ways, came as a complete shock because, you know, you sort of work under pressure in China for so many years. You know, you're sort of used to sort of the surveillance and the harassment, you know, at low levels, and that, you know, in some cases, you know, a bit more severe. But, you know, it still sort of comes as a surprise, right, when it sort of this really happens. But in other ways, you know, we had seen just a couple of weeks earlier, if you recall, there were the 3 Wall Street Journal reporters who were kicked out, right? So, and then of course there was the sort of tit for tat cycle between the U.S., the Trump administration, and China that had been sort of slowly unfolding in the early months of the latter months of 2019, early months of 2020. So maybe the writing was on the wall. But, you know, it was still kind of, you know, came to as a shock to many of us. It was really just like I don't want to say like a fire sale, but I remember, you know, trying to schedule movers to come. And it was like, you know, they're looking at their schedule and they're like, yeah, you know, we have to go to, you know, Steve Meyer's house and Ray Jong's house before you. And, you know, it's like, these are all like friends and colleagues that I know. And, you know, and it's like, well, okay, I'll just say that business was pretty good for the moving company that month.
I'll bet. Yeah, there's always a business story, right? So I wanted to ask all of you, thank you, and thank you for the detail in answering that. I wanted to ask all of you kind of the obvious question as a journalist, you know, given these departures and the increasing pressures between the US and China, how is this affecting coverage within China? And you've all to some degree been covering China now from elsewhere, as many people have. Can you effectively do that? What has been lost in coverage of many decades of experience, all these people leaving China in the last few years? I don't know who wants to take that. Chris, you want to take a stab at that? As you were one of those very experienced people who left.
I'll take a first stab and just make one point, which is that I think one of the great losses of the expulsions and also the general tightening for journalists who remain in China is that it's become much more difficult to do those textured on-the-ground stories about people's lives. And I think those stories are so important to give people a more nuanced and multidimensional understanding of China, its people, their views of things, their lives. And that's become not impossible, and we continue to work at it, but it's become much more difficult, I think. And I think that's, if I was going to single out one of the losses of having to work from abroad, that would be it.
Yeah, and also, well, like Wuhan, I mean, we look at your coverage there and, the depth we got when you were there and able to write, it's hard to think if we didn't have people there who were doing that, whether we would know as much as we knew, early on.
Yes, I just add on that point, I think not having reporters on the ground, it actually makes it more difficult in some ways to sort of address rumors or conspiracy theories or simply misleading cliches about China when you're not on the ground and you can't point to something and say, no, this is the reality.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Yvonne, what's your sense of that? I mean, you're in Taiwan.
I completely agree about the human connection. I think for me, having left the mainland now, that's really my biggest regret, is losing that. The being able to just simply talk to people. And the interesting thing about China is that the people are so open still, given how difficult it has become to be a reporter, especially I would say trying to film for television in China has become really quite difficult. But you can still get people to talk to you very openly on the streets. And I think that that does bring the nuance to the story. It brings that human connection. I think that we are all the poorer for that. And you can't recreate that when you're out of it.
So what is happening now is your understanding in terms of surveillance and monitoring of correspondence? And what are the implications? Obviously a big worry, and we had this even in Hong Kong as things got tighter, is self-censoring and the inability to really be able to write much of anything except what is kind of handed to you, and especially when there's fewer and fewer foreign correspondents there. What is your sense of how things are there? We have I'll dovetail that with a question from Bill Holstein, a former president of the Overseas Press Club and who's leading our kind of China working group. He says, how bad do you think this is going to get? Is there more to come? Gerry, I guess we'll ask you that, since you were part of this wave. What is your sense of how things are there now in terms of being able to do your work day to day and how bad it's become?
Yeah, well, reporting in China has always been very tricky, given that people, sort of, every corner of society, the population relies on WeChat as a, as the mode of communication. And, that is, the WeChat accounts for journalists are frequently closely surveilled. And so, basically, doing even relatively sort of simple and straightforward interviews on subjects that are potentially sensitive, can be pretty tricky. And of course, that's not to mention when you travel to places like Xinjiang, where, essentially the moment you step off the plane, there are local propaganda department officials who people, waiting for you outside the gate, outside the terminal, offering to take you to see the nearest jade factory or whatever other touristy sites that they had in mind for you, or if they don't, they sort of tail you for the next week, and basically prevent any hope of doing sort of unobstructed reporting. But back to this point of if we were already working in this environment that was so closely surveilled technologically, that was already so difficult to kind of do reporting, it makes it even harder when we are outside of the country, because before, just purely speaking, in the sort of the circles of kind of policy reporting or government related or political reporting, despite the extreme sensitivity and kind of a reluctance to chat over social media, there were still plenty of sort of think tankers or government advisors or professors who were happy to talk to you if it was within the closed confines of their office. That's one of the great things about China is you call up some of these experts and they say, oh, hey, come over to my office in Tsinghua in 2 hours. They're remarkably open in that way. You can't have those conversations because you can't show up at Tsinghua University in 2 hours from Taiwan, and so it diminishes our ability to understand sort of the logic of some of these Chinese policies, get a better, fuller picture, a more nuanced picture of the thinking that goes behind the scenes inside China, and we're all diminished for it.
Yeah, Yvonne, what you were there until recently. Have you sort of seen this? To Bill's question about is it getting worse, and is there more to come, or have we reached a point where this is as bad as it gets? I mean, what's sort of your sense of the trajectory of this and the kind of pressure and the pressure that your husband felt and therefore your family felt? Do you see this as something that is going to be more routine now?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think for a long time, perhaps we hoped that things would get better because people always said that. You go through these peaks and troughs, and after there's a crackdown, there's an opening up. This has always been kind of accepted wisdom. But things have only been going in one direction for the past 10 years, effectively. And I think that it is only going to get worse. I feel that officials in Beijing are worried. I think they are concerned about the international message. I think they blame international journalists for that. I think that we're very much seen as a problem. And I don't think it's going to get any better. I think that it is only going to get worse. And I think that we're ending up in a situation now where the people who are allowed to stay in China on a full, year-long visa are doing so because they haven't kind of come across the radar of the officials. The officials aren't angry with them over their reporting. And I think what they would like is that to continue to have a number of foreign press in Beijing, but to make sure that they are compliant. And I think the problem with that is that it ends up as kind of window dressing for the government. As long as they can get rid of all the people who cause trouble, and then keep the people who compliant with what they want to project as an image. And I think that is obviously a huge issue for foreign reporting.
Yeah, and of course that sets up a new standard, right, for who is going to be allowed to stay. I wanted to ask a question, and I'm going to ask Gerry this first because he was caught in this. So during the Trump administration, there were constant threats about revoking visas and work permits of Chinese journalists, those working for state-owned media, as well as those employed by other news organizations, including some Western news organizations. The Biden administration has signaled it will loosen some of those restrictions, but obviously has been talking tough on China, including just this week at the G7 and NATO meetings. How do the actions of the US government contribute to the tensions this kind of so-called tit for tat kind of arrangement. You know, you mess with our visa, we'll mess with your visa. And are journalists increasingly caught in the middle? And is this really the case now that we're going to see going forward? And Gerry, as you are somebody who one could arguably say was caught in the middle, tell us what you think about that.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think the framing that this is, sort of explicitly a tit for tat issue has been the messaging from the Chinese, from the beginning. When I was, a day before I left China, I had a meeting with the foreign ministry in which they said, this is not personal. If you have a problem or if you're angry about, being forced to leave, then, you should take it up with your government because they're the ones who started this. And I guess I would say that, on some level, I think there certainly was a cycle of sort of, recriminations and tit for tat coming from both sides. At the same time, I also believe that, it is probably a false equivalence to say that the work that American journalists do is the same as what a reporter for Xinhua and what a reporter at CCTV does. I think that, sort of in terms of editorial independence, in terms of just the essential function and our reason for being, right? These are sort of, very much different systems. So I would be wary of making that direct comparison to say that, well, China is justified in doing what it did, or that, this is a kind of a pure sort of, tit for tat situation. I'm not sure I'm really qualified to say whether Trump administration should have done what it had with the Chinese state media reporters. But I think that, at least from the Chinese perspective, if the Biden administration were to back off and to let some Chinese state media employees back into the U.S., China would probably oblige. And with visas for American journalists, and it's it might be one of those issues that can be separated out. As Biden has said that they want to sort of work together on things like climate while maintaining kind of an overall posture of strategic competition. It's I don't see why sort of journalist visas is one of those things that necessarily continues down this death spiral.
Chris, do you have thoughts on that? And and particularly on that false equivalency issue, which is an interesting way to put it.
Well, I'd address this issue from a slightly different, broader perspective, which is, quite apart from the specifics of the tit for tat of questions of reciprocity about journalist visas. It's an undeniable fact that these actions have been taking place at a time when there's much more tension in the relationship, particularly between China and the United States. And I would say a much more ideological edge to that tension as well. And because so many of the stories that we do are, they do touch on these sensitive issues for China, the Chinese government, there's no denying it. Xinjiang, Hong Kong, human rights, the image and standing of Xi Jinping himself. All of these issues are sort of bound up with the Chinese government's perception that it is in this time of much more intense ideological contestation. So I'm not saying that journalists are then warriors in that contest, but it's an unavoidable fact that some of these stories that we do, on their merits, do become a part of this sort of discourse of, if you like, of contestation with the West. And I think that's sort of, part of one of the sublayers that lies behind the expulsions. And I think what we would say is seems to be the fact that the Chinese government is not eager to welcome us back as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We have some other good questions. I'm going to ask one now. This is from Eric Wishart, who's with the AFP in Hong Kong and is on the board of the FCC there. He wants to ask about Xi Jinping's recent call for China to develop a more lovable image. Is that possible? And did China overplay its hand with its wolf warrior diplomacy? So this isn't as much about journalism, but about China's image. Who would like to take that? I'll throw it open. Great.
Yeah, I think the wolf warrior diplomacy, I think is obviously it's such an interesting topic, and I think people have kicked it around a lot recently. After I left, the Chinese embassy in Dublin issued a rather bizarre statement, which kind of went viral. It was about it was quoting an Aesop's fable, and it was about the wolf and the lamb, and how China is not a lamb, sort of indicating that China will bite back if they're upset. And I think it's certainly in Ireland, that comment from an official channel in the wake of the departure of an Irish journalist really did kind of make people realize that. I got a lot of messages from people who felt that this was not in order, and they felt that they had kind of overstepped the line. And I think that's kind of representative of some a lot of in public opinion. Sometimes it can have quite a negative effect. And I don't think, though, that it's necessarily going to change. I think it is very much a theme and a style. And that's become synonymous, and I'm not sure that there's any call to change that. I'd be interested to hear if people agree, but I can't see that changing anytime soon.
Yeah, Gerry, do you have thoughts on that? Whether there's kind of this blowback, any kind of blowback to the whole wolf warrior, or is this this is just another thing that the world will just have to live with?
Yeah, I find sort of the messaging coming out of China to be sort of incredibly contradictory. I mean, it's quite clear that the likes of the wolf warrior arms of the government apparatus are in the ascendancy. They have continued to carry out their messaging with without any apparent sort of restraints or kind of efforts to rein them back in. And at the same time, there's the edict coming down from on high that we need more positive messaging. It seems to sort of be a kind of a perennial desire from the top leadership to kind of spread more positive energy, quote unquote, about China. And it's just very difficult to see how these dueling mandates get how you square the circle. It's just, yeah, I really can't see any easy way for them.
Great. Well, in terms of image, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Olympics. So the OPC, as many of you know, but maybe not everyone on the call knows, along with 28 other media and press freedom groups, we have sent a letter, we spearheaded this letter to the International Olympic Committee, urging it to include press freedom issues in its talks with the government in Beijing leading up to the Winter Olympics to be held next February. And we may have some news on that letter this week, stay tuned. But how important is this an issue to press freedom? Would a commitment by the IOC to press freedom during the Olympics change things for journalists there? Does this matter? I guess I'll start with Chris. I think I know what you're going to say, but go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking back to the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics, and at that point, the Chinese government was much more eager to establish a better relationship with the rest of the world, a better image, and to that extent, a better relationship with journalists stationed in China. And there was lifting of restrictions on travel for foreign journalists at that point, but it didn't take very long for informal restrictions to fall into place. And for the decade or more since then, I think it's become, in many ways, not 100%, but in many ways much more difficult. And so when we think about the next Winter Olympics in China, and what to expect from them. I think as I said to you, Jodi, beforehand, I maybe wouldn't call myself a pessimist, but maybe a realist. I think just given where China is at the moment, given where the world is at the moment, given the power of officials in China to read rules or circumvent rules or to apply rules in ways that meet their very particular ends, I think we have to have modest expectations about what a call from the IOC would do for international press freedom in China, especially in the longer term. So by that I mean it may well be that for a few months over the Winter Olympics, there's a certain easing of conditions for journalists who are there. But longer term, I think these sort of larger pressures within the system, including the ones that Yvonne and Gerry were just talking about, would overwhelm those efforts. Now, that doesn't mean I think change is impossible, but I think change, when it comes, as with so many things in China, will come from sort of domestic dynamics rather than from pressure from the outside world.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Yvonne, your thoughts on this and the Olympics? Yeah. And I'm sure, before you left, you were thinking, well, this would probably be part of what you would cover. Yeah. And what are your thoughts on that? Whether this this pressure or potential pressure would ease the situation at all there?
Well, look, I think it's worth a try. I think I would be equally, not massively optimistic about it making a real change. I think if there is going to be any change, then it's going to be ahead of the Winter Olympics, and there could be, some overtures made to the press corps. And it's definitely worth trying to apply a bit of pressure outside. I think, it'd be wrong to kind of give the impression that China reporting is somehow over. It's really far from over. There are so many people still inside the country doing incredible reporting, despite the pressures that they're under and these growing pressures. So I think anything that can help to draw attention to that and to make their lives a little bit easier is definitely worth trying.
Yeah, that's great. That's one of our poll quotes. It's far from over, and I think that's really true for us to all keep in mind that people are trying to do really good work under really difficult pressures there. Gerry, is this an effort that could make a difference?
Yeah, I think I would agree with both Chris and Yvonne. It's one of these things that given the political climate domestically in China today. It's hard to see how sort of these efforts might necessarily kind of yield direct results. But at the same time, it's as good an opportunity as ever, right? When sort of all eyes are in China. And this is a moment when, you will have presumably hundreds of journalists coming into China to cover a sporting event that China does, in fact, want coverage for. And, this, like Chris said, China did want foreign media coverage of the 2008 Olympics. It continues to want foreign media coverage of its domestic political events. It invites large international cable TV networks to come cover its military parades and its party congresses, and so why should we have hundreds of reporters there to cover the Olympics, but not the ones who are actually assigned to cover the country day in and day out? So I think that it's as good a chance as any to I think make the point, but would it have any immediate results? That's hard to say.
Good, thank you. We have some other good questions, and please keep sending them. This is from James McGregor, who says, Wes, saying that we're seeing more and more stories about China from outside China by journalists without China experience or expertise. And we've talked a little bit about this, but he says, our editors keyed into this and working to handle this problem with people who may not have as much expertise as others. I'm not sure. I guess another way to amplify that question is to say, what do news organizations do? And perhaps you all might reflect a little. And Yvonne, I guess I'll give this to you because you're still trying to cover China from that region. well, not being on the mainland, obviously, what can you try to do? What can organizations, try to do to make up for some of this?
I think that the American organizations have been more successful in pivoting to a new model, having some of their journalists outside the country and others still inside. And I think for the bigger organizations, that's a very good way around it. And as the question mentioned, the people who continue to report outside of China and produce brilliant work on China are often the ones who've spent a long time there, who have this kind of deep China expertise. And I think that they can continue to do that outside the country. I think the danger comes when people who have never set foot in the country are trying to cover it. And I think that for a lot of organizations, and I think maybe this applies more to Europe than it does to the US, they've been caught on the hop a bit when it comes to the rise of China. It's almost like China kind of, as a rising superpower, snuck up on a lot of newsrooms and they weren't prepared for it. And I don't think that there's been enough investment in developing China expertise, in improving diversity, encouraging people with language skills to cover China, or willingness to fund posts in the country, send people out there. And I think that is an issue. So you have a lot of newspapers who, I would say, especially in Europe, who have been trying to cover the situation throughout the coronavirus from a distance. And I think you can tell when people don't have that level of expertise that, some of the newspapers represented here today would have.
Good, thank you. Pete Engardio, one of my OPC colleagues, asked, can you talk a little bit about cyber surveillance of journalists? How pervasive it is becoming, and how does it affect journalists' ability to meet or speak with sources? And sources is a question I had as well, that I had prepared, that this seems to me that this is a real difficulty. And frankly, I was even seeing this in Hong Kong before I left, after the national security law had been imposed on Hong Kong. People who used to speak even about things like the economy were no longer speaking as freely. Can you talk a little bit about that, Chris? And you were there a long time. Did you over time find it, with increased surveillance, more and more difficult to get people to talk to you?
I think the general political atmosphere in China and the tightening of that atmosphere over the past few years has had much of a chilling effect as direct surveillance of people. And we as journalists and people we talk to, our friends, interview subjects, we're all generally aware that our electronic communications, our use of WeChat, the popular Chinese social media platform that everybody uses, that all of that may be surveilled. And so when you approach people, when you try to organize things, of course you have to be cautious. But I always found it was a sort of a balancing act that we had to achieve. The Chinese state security apparatus is very large, very busy. The quality of the people inside varies enormously from area to area, is all I would say. But they also have an awful lot of other people to surveil as well. So I think sometimes they're sort of drowning themselves in their own information. And so, so you have to be aware of that when you approach somebody. And I don't think it was a matter of sort of exercising due caution, but not exercising so much caution that you might appear that you were doing something clandestine or something that wasn't your job to do as a journalist. So I always thought it was a question of maintaining that balance. And as I said, the quality of state security in China has certainly expanded, but you come across extremely skilled operatives, you come across quite a few clowns as well. I just want to add something to Jim McGregor's question as well. I think one of the worries now is that, I'm old enough that it was possible to stumble into journalism in China at a time when work conditions there were much more relaxed, when getting visas was much easier, when the general environment for working there was easier as well. And my worry is now that all of those aspiring journalists who want to break into China reporting, it's become so much more difficult for them now. And I think, as a community, that's something we have to think about as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good, sad point, but an important one.
Jodi, can I add
yeah,
something about I thought Jim asked a really interesting question. And I think that, I guess, maybe working at the Post and sort of, I might be sort of, a bit more attuned to that world, but I have noticed that kind of as China has become a bigger and bigger subject in Washington, we've seen just, I guess, an explosion of coverage, particularly sort of from the national security and sort of foreign policy and diplomatic worlds, coming out of sort of DC journalism. And, I think that is both for better and worse. I think it's fantastic that, these issues are getting the attention and the discussion and the debate that it deserves. But maybe what Jim is referring to is that these are very much kind of discussions inherently from that sort of American national security sort of perspective that might miss the broader picture, and what in which sort of the reporters and the sources may not necessarily have as nuanced and sort of in-country experience and knowledge as we might like. That said, I have also noticed this trend of more and more, at least American outlets, employing former China correspondents to cover U.S.-China out of Washington. I think they bring a huge sort of reservoir of knowledge and experience, and I think that's only a great thing. And I think as more and more outlets add those positions, that's definitely a positive in my book.
Right. Well, and all of you who are still sort of covering China or not, in your case, will be, but you don't lose that, right? And your news organization doesn't lose that. So I think that's an important point.
And I think editors are seeing that. Yeah, they're seeing the value of that.
Yeah, great. So we have an interesting question here and kind of a little background. This is from Melinda Liu, who's the Newsweek Beijing bureau chief. So thank you for being on, and she thanks, she's thanking the panel and says that there's great insights. We're happy to hear that. But she says, as someone who was involved in the Foreign Correspondents Club of China as an FCCC president in the run-up to the 2008 Olympics, her observation of the Olympics would be, you're going to need every tiny bit of leverage you can get. So use it, even if you don't think much will come out of it. I think it's an interesting point. She says, today, the 2007 to 2008 period stands out as an example of how things got somewhat better. Better is always better. The problem is it may not last. And she says, how ironic and telling is that some now look back with nostalgia to the days of Jiang Zemin. She's also saying, and I think the point she's making, I don't know if there's really a question here, but somebody might want to remark on it, is we look back, even a few years ago with nostalgia, or to some degree with nostalgia. And I guess this gets to another question that was asked earlier, are these the really bad days for journalists, and might we see something better, or is this the sort of new normal for what journalism could be in China, that all our news organizations are going to have to think of as, this is how we cover things. I guess I'll ask Chris to take that, having been there through a lot of years, a lot of different Chinese presidents, a lot of US presidents.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think through the question and the observation about the Olympics. I'm certainly not saying give up. I do think in the end, though, that lasting change in China is going to be generated by whatever happens domestically. And we have to remind ourselves that we have seen these periods, well, let me put it this way, that foreign journalists in China are simply a small part of an ecosystem in China, which a much more important part of that is our colleagues, our friends in the Chinese journalist world and the work they do. And what we've seen over time, I'm thinking of SARS in 2003. I'm thinking of the political scandals and infighting that led up to Xi Jinping becoming leader in 2012. I'm thinking of COVID-19 in Wuhan last year. You know, you see in those periods that although the Chinese Communist Party is extremely powerful and in many ways enjoys broad backing from many people in China, there can also be a hunger for information from the population in China. And Chinese journalists can respond to that when given the opportunity. And it's certainly the case in COVID last year that a lot of, well, almost, so much of the most important reporting about what happened in the early days, what went wrong, what the missteps were, that was led by Chinese journalists and Chinese news outlets who in many ways pushing the envelope. So, in some ways, I do think it's still true that we as foreign journalists have to ride the tides of general control of information in China. And I think those tides can go in and out. And even under Xi Jinping, even now, we saw last year that, when there's a crisis, when something goes wrong, people hunger for information. And I don't think that hunger is going to go away. That doesn't mean that it's going to manifest itself in the way that some Western politicians like. It doesn't mean that it's going to lead to particular pathways to change in China, but I think that desire is still there.
Yeah, good point. Good point to make. I'm going to throw this out here. I don't know that there's a question, but this is from Steve Butler, who many of us know. Hi, Steve. Thanks for the question. Will expelled journalists apply to return for the Olympics in Beijing? He says accreditation depends on national committees. Does anyone think that there's, if someone's going to do that? I'm not so sure, but it's an interesting idea.
Australia has very little snow and it's not a leader in winter sports, but I'll certainly be applying.
Very good. Gerry or Yvonne, do you want to take a stab at that?
That's probably not my decision.
All right.
People more senior than me will be making that call.
Good. Okay. Good. Well, thanks to Steve for the question. We have a question from Jocelyn Ford, who's been working with us on the OPC China Working Group. She asked, what should the financial and business communities be aware of regarding how China's restrictions on reporting affect information related to their decision making? That's an interesting question, one that they're grappling with in Hong Kong now. The business community had been fairly had been going along with the changes because they didn't have much choice, and now seem to be realizing that this can really affect their business, particularly open markets. I'd be interested, and maybe Gerry, you want to take a stab at that in terms of, whether this is something that businesses. Whether, and perhaps when you were there, did you see businesses start to kind of push back on this in the financial community, not just the journalism community, because it started not being in their interests?
Yeah, one sort of anecdote that comes to mind, I'm not sure what the takeaway is. I just recall, if we start from the premise that financial markets sort of rely on instantaneous and sort of transparent sort of dissemination of material information. I just remember in 2019, there was this bizarre case when at the height of the trade war, Trump's sort of comments and his tweets and his statements about tariffs were censored inside China, but the markets would sort of tank when he would go off on one of these rants on Twitter about tariffs. And there were people sort of kind of asking on Chinese social media, like, hey, what's going on? Like, why is the market down? I mean, of course, Chinese investors, a great deal, many of them are very savvy and know how to use VPN and can immediately figure out, what exactly happened. But I guess, it's just sort of, it was an example that pointed to some of the contradictions between, some of these political controls and sort of China's aspirations to become a major international financial center. And so how does it, how does that work out? I don't know, but I think that international firms in Hong Kong, my understanding is that they are starting to think about next steps and what they have to do, where they have to move people out of Hong Kong. And it's a very sensitive subject for Hong Kong authorities, but international capital knows that the writing is on the wall, and at some point it's not in their best interest to remain in this in an environment.
Yeah, Yvonne or Chris, do you have any thoughts on that, on the financial community, and whether there's anything they can do or anything they are likely to do, given the information situation in China writ large, including Hong Kong?
I don't have too much to add to what Gerry was saying, apart from the observation that we have seen with China being such a big business story and such a big story in tech in particular. You're seeing that interest from readers, from audiences, from news companies reflected in the amount of effort that's going into reporting those stories and the creative ways in which journalists are finding ways to report these issues out, even if they can't be on the ground in China, or even if being on the ground in China doesn't get you the full story. And I think, as you know, with Bloomberg, Jodi, there's a great deal of very good work being done on data-driven journalism, so people can get to a story in China, even if some ways you can't be fully on the ground there.
Yeah, good, thank you. Well, we have just a few minutes left, so I want to kind of do a lightning round at the end, and ask, is there anything that organizations can do that will help reporting in China, including helping Chinese journalists? International organizations, including like ours, are tasked with the decision of whether to put out statements or do things, because A, they may not be effective, but B, they may be, they may hurt, they may harm by being this kind of foreign influence mechanism that has been certainly that has been part of the propaganda out of China, that anything they don't like is influenced by foreign, there's foreign influence involved. So I guess my lightning round question is there, do you see anything that organizations can or should do? And maybe it's as simple as continuing to talk about it. So I'll start with you, Chris, and then go to Yvonne and then Gerry.
I was just writing down a couple of points to make this very quickly. First of all, I would like to go back to that point of many countries, many media organizations facing the problem now that we have many younger journalists who aspire to work in China, and those opportunities simply aren't opening up in the way that they used to be. So I think it's sort of important for us to think about how we can nurture that next generation of Chinese journalists working in China, and what can be done to sort of provide opportunities so that they have opportunities to build up that expertise and on-the-ground experience, which is so important. Apart from that, all I can offer, I'm afraid, is a couple of platitudes about the importance of principles and patience. I mean, we have to remind ourselves this is, insofar as governments or organizations or journalistic outlets are going to be taking up these issues, I think it's important that we take them up as matter of principles that apply not just to China, the Chinese government, but in a sense universally. And so speaking up for freedom of the press is important, not simply when it's a matter in China, but when it's a matter in any part of the world. And just finally, the other platitude, I'm afraid, is patience as well. And the need to understand that while it's important to focus on key events like the Olympics, change in China is going to take time, whatever form it takes. And so, you have to be willing to invest that time to see results.
Good, thank you. I think the younger journalists is a real issue. Maybe it's something we should all be thinking about, with scholarships or those kinds of things to really help nurture that next generation. Yvonne, Are there, what are the things we should be doing, we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think this comes down to China expertise again. And I think that, you know, media outlets need to develop an understanding of how China works, so that when they have people in the field, they as a headquarters know when it's sensible to apply pressure, you know, perhaps through the Chinese embassy in their home country, when it's sensible to back off. And I think you need to have the background and the expertise in order to make that judgment call, especially when you have local staff employed in China. You need to tread carefully, and you need to understand how the system works. So I think not having that expertise in your media outlet at home and also in country is a problem. And I think that's what needs to be addressed. And it's about prioritizing China and making it, you know, a story that we all need to be focused on, that newsroom resources need to be targeted at. And yeah, I think for me, it would come down to that expertise.
Good, thank you. And Gerry, we'll give you the last word on this question.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I fully agree with Chris and Yvonne. And yeah, you know, what Yvonne said about sort of, you know, having more knowledge, better judgment from headquarters about all the complicated issues we're dealing with in China. And I think this was also a point that Chris had mentioned offline, which is that let's not, in the discussion about all of the difficulties that the correspondents face, let's not forget about the situation that many of our Chinese colleagues who, as many of you know, work very closely with the sort of the foreign correspondents in China, some of the difficulties and sensitivities and the precarious situations that they're facing. You know, they are Chinese nationals. They serve as researchers, translators. Really, they do the jobs of full journalists, but due to Chinese policies and regulations, they can't be accredited as correspondents. But they're absolutely invaluable, and often in sort of you know, in fraught times like now, they're the ones who face the most pressure. And we've seen our colleagues in the last year or two who have been Chinese nationals who have been detained and haven't been heard from, have been forced to quit, and it's worrying. And I think that, yeah, if we could just all keep them in mind as well, as we discuss some of these issues about you know, what foreign correspondents face in China, yeah, it would be great, because it's very, very important.
I think that's really a good point. They can't get on planes, and I mean, even though it's tough to be expelled, this is their country, and whatever happens to them and their families living there. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists. I don't know if you guys are seeing the chat, but there's a whole lot of high fives and virtual applause going on for the panelists. So I want to echo that and thank everybody for their wisdom, their honesty, and their willingness to have this conversation. And maybe we'll you know, keep going with this. We'll do this again. So thank you, and I throw it back to Patricia, our OBC director, to close.
Well, thank you, Jodi, for taking this on. And thank you to Chris and Yvonne and Gerry for a very informative morning panel. And we really appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Or good morning.
Good night.